Nice to meet you all. Kristi Ebong. I'm actually at an interesting inflection point. I've spent the last 3 years of my career at Cedars-Sinai down in Los Angeles. I reside here in San Francisco. And at Cedars, I've been leading emerging technology for the enterprise health system. So what that means is I was responsible for launching our accelerator. We had a partnership with Techstars for the last 2.5, almost 3 years now, where we've evaluated over 3,000 companies, bringing in about 10 startups every 9 to 10 months or so. 80% of the companies that come into our program have raised between 1 and 3 mil coming in, so it's definitely an accelerator, not an incubator, so they have product, usually a customer or two in market. And then I am actually on day number 2 of my newest opportunity with Orbita. Many of you saw Bill present earlier this morning. Orbita is an enterprise-grade voice-as-a-service company in the voice and chatbot space. So think almost like WordPress for voice designers. We're selling to enterprise customers. But for today, I'm going to be wearing my Cedars-Sinai investment hat, talking a little bit about some predictions, things I've seen in the market for earlier stage companies, and specifically from 3 angles. So one is the buyer angle. So who's the commercial buyer? How are we thinking about things as a buyer? The second as an investor, and then the third as an entrepreneur. A few considerations I think that we're going to increasingly see is over the last 4 to 5 years, we've had a glut of money in healthcare and digital health, med devices, health tech in particular. And I think what we're starting to really understand is that money is money. A lot of folks have money, but what we are looking at as buyers is really, when it comes to the entrepreneurs and investors and their network, what is it in terms of strategic partnerships and strategic partners that you bring to the table? And so particularly valuable with a lot of strategics, say if it's a provider system, is the data set that they bring, the customer base, the patient population, the clinical users, the clinical providers, and then a couple of underrepresented groups in particular are the technology stakeholders. So the engineers and the back-end CTO teams at some of these large organizations, provider organizations, payers, and then the business side of the business. So at Cedars-Sinai, it's a $3 billion business, and a huge part of that business and the operational challenges that the organization faced are inherently in how the business is run and in operations, and not necessarily clinical or medical problems in nature. Another consideration for investment is that I think we're starting to see the early phases of how budgeting is done, especially at provider entities, shifting. There was a recent, I think it was a New York Times article talking about how traditional P&L structures at health systems and hospitals is inherently problematic because there's not money for a lot of the stuff that we're all doing. And so you're starting to see really innovative players, a lot of the names that you've heard here today, Cedars-Sinai, Cleveland Clinic, Intermountain, New York Presbyterians, that are hiring new roles, specifically chief innovation officers, chief patient experience officers. We're starting to see some folks on the business side as well that are tasked with doing this new lift, chief clinical transformation officers. And so look for those players, look for the budgets that they have, and try to see where you can fit your company or your portfolio company in there. Another consideration, or set of considerations for investors in particular, Silicon Valley's been under a lot of fire for the last year or two around diversity and inclusion. Those that know me know that I'm outspoken on this, and I think what we're seeing is the challenges are not at the superficial level, but really that when we don't have representation at the table and we have certain patterns that we look for in how we hire and how we staff, we are excluding an entire swath of the population. We're completely neglecting to understand how other people live. I like to use my Minnesota roots as an example. How my extended family in northern Minnesota, 4.5 hours drive north of Minneapolis, thinks, operates, behaves, and feels is going to be very different than my neighbors in San Francisco. And so understanding the markets that we're serving, the markets that are underserved and that are actually financially of huge opportunity, is really important. And we're starting to see that cross-pollination in executive staffing, in teams. You've seen entities like Providence St. Joe's hired their chief digital officer out of Amazon. That's an obvious big shift in terms of hiring someone from a different background. And obviously, from a diversity inclusion perspective, there's plenty of articles and headlines on that as well. Diversification. So I think another thing that we're seeing is there's not just one right solution for AI or for voice. We're starting to see that some of these are a sea change, and there are entire ecosystems emerging. So if you look at voice in particular, one question we get asked a lot now at Orbita is, well, what if Amazon or Google tries to do what you're doing? And the answer is really that if you look at some of these, I call them big dogs, Amazon, Google, Apple, the area in which they're responsible for solving hard problems is becoming increasingly clear. They're solving hard problems around how voice is processed into a microphone, the hardware problems of proximity of voice to a hardware within an defined space, solving challenges around language, accents, things like that. Not saying that there's not other players that are going to be in that space, but we're starting to see that the big dogs are responsible for a certain area. There's also this huge arena in the middle where business users and business enterprises have an extraordinary need. And my gut is that some of those Amazon, Google, and Apple players are not going to be working in that space anytime soon, and may never. Because if you have an Alexa device, you're not necessarily going to go after the Google Home market. The Google search market. And so it's the frenemies phenomenon that we often see in Silicon Valley, just with a new hat on. Another consideration from an investment perspective around diversification is that we're starting to see funds being a little bit larger. Second and third funds are starting to demonstrate this and demonstrate diversification. So whereas 3 years ago, an investment entity or a VC may have one voice solution or one AI solution, now we're starting to see them potentially have multiples and seeing how those players can work together. Enabling technologies. This is a big one for the buyers out in the market. So any provider making an investment or a buy decision has tried in the last 5 to 6 years to purchase point solutions in, say, cardiology or in orthopedics or in pediatrics, and then hire a chief medical officer from that specialty, and then try to scale it to other specialties and realize it's really, really hard. And that's just on the clinical side, not let alone the technology side. So what we're starting to see is that the enabling technologies that are optimizing existing infrastructure and looking at platform that really has that foundational element in place for scale, those are the ones that are really starting to win big in the space. And then, in my opinion, some of the market shifters are really around voice and AI because they pay respect to existing infrastructure. Love it or hate it, Epic, Cerner, Allscripts, they're not going to go away anytime soon. If you're a chief information officer and you just spent $20 million on an implementation, just because a new company comes along with nicer, easier to click buttons or simpler workflows, it's not gonna replace the existing investment. So being able to optimize that investment that's already been made, being able to work with it and make it better is really a big opportunity. And then last but not least, some entrepreneurship considerations. I referenced earlier the frenemies phenomenon. As many of you know, Apple, Intel, Google, Microsoft, there's an interesting interdependency or codependency that a lot of these have. Some of them use the other's chips, and then they develop their own chips. Some of them use the other's software, and then they develop their own software. They hire each other's leadership. And I think we're also going to see that in the health tech space. And I don't look at that as a bad thing. I think it's a really critical thing. I just have a little bit of time left. So also looking at collaborating. So really the bigger the network that you have as an entrepreneur, the more opportunities that you have to partner, and finding your space and finding where you want to double down. What's your core business? I say that with my Orbita hat on. One of the big reasons that I'm so excited about what we're doing at Orbita is because we've identified that voice is hard if it's not your core business. And if it is your core business and you can enable other players, that's a wonderful opportunity. I think we're starting to see a lot of companies out there. And then there's always the hardware, device, Internet of Things enabled data play. Data is dollars, and I think we're going to increasingly see a lot of opportunities around that people are really willing to pay for. So, thank you.